We had this tiny little movie that cost $500,000, which to date has grossed just under $1 billion. It's just an amazing phenomenon.
And not only were we shocked and surprised and pleased, but amazed that we even finished the film.
I hear from people all over the world, and I don't quite understand what the wonderful, captivating thing is about this particular film.
I never dreamed when I was doing the film then the effect it would have on so many people.
There's actually a lot of thought and a lot of real talent that goes into these pictures.
Friday the 13th was one of the innovators, I would say, of this slasher movie, but where the characters all represented people that each one of us knew.
The best horror movies find a way to tap into something that's truly human.
And there is something so compelling about the genre that people will always come back to it.
I think that the goal is about scaring the audience and fear and vulnerability.
We don't know why, but it's something in us that likes to be scared.
When I don't watch the movie, I pick somebody out in the audience and then watch the evolution of their heart attack.
It's not rocket science. It's fun. It's exciting.
The fans so adore this character. They like Jason more than they like the survivors.
They sort of brought a life to it that it would have never had without him.
That's where the power lies, is Jason never dies because the audience brings him back to life, the devoted fans of Jason.
It's a great character to watch and see what he'll do next. I don't think it'll really ever come to a complete end.
A lot of us relate to Jason because Jason is the outcast. Like in school, either you're too tall, you're too short, you're too heavy, you have buck teeth, you speak with a lisp. We all tie in somehow going, oh, I understand that I was a different kid. It's just a basic part of the human struggle.
Jason represents that force that you're going to come up against. You know, we all want to be that person that feels like we can, stop evil and save the person that we love.
I think that we need these monsters, these boogeymen, these characters who embody all evil, because we can't deal with the real evil that we have to in our day-to-day lives.
If you can take that darkness out and look at it, then you can conquer it, you can defeat it, you can actually deal with it. It's when we try and hide it from the light that it overcomes us.
In the early 1970s, Connecticut-based filmmaker Sean S. Cunningham was struggling to make a name for himself, scraping by on a diet of industrial shorts and commercials, and even the occasional softcore porn.
Back in the early 70s, big change was happening in the movie business. There had been success with the documentary forms and with handheld cameras, and there was a sense of anything was possible. Just grab your camera, grab your equipment, get in the back of the station wagon, go shoot it. You can compete with the big guys.
He was making little movies. There was a film he made called Together, and it starred Marilyn Chambers, who went to the local high school. It was a marital aid film for couples who were trying to strengthen their marital bond, as it would be in the bedroom.
We had a mutual friend, his name was Rudd Talbot, who I was working with on a film. I think he helped Sean raise some of the money. And this movie, Case of the Full Moon Murders, it starred Harry Reams. It was very soft in the softcore world.
7:35 a.m. We were shown to a bedroom. A male corpse with an enormous erection was covered with a blanket. Our suspicions were immediately aroused.
In the mid-70s, everybody said we need nice, clean, wholesome films. So we did 2 very nice, clean, wholesome films. And they made absolutely $0.
And now I had to get another job. Somehow or other, I had to get something going.
That something turned out to be 1972's Last House on the Left.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie.
The film, produced by Cunningham and directed by Wes Craven, who would go on to create 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, presented a brutal portrait of violence and visceral horror in small-town America.
Well, we were co-producers of Last House on the Left, which I think was a very important horror film, and it's still playing today all over the world.
Although none of Sean Cunningham's early efforts achieved mainstream success, his next brainchild, with a considerable debt owed to John Carpenter's 1978 screen shocker, Halloween, would launch a whole new subgenre of horror.
And I had thought of this title some time ago called Friday the 13th. And I said to myself, if I had a film called Friday the 13th, I could sell that.
And Sean called me up and said, Halloween is making incredible money at the box office, let's rip it off. That is keeping it real.
Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take out an ad in Variety and put at the top, from the people who brought you Last House on the Left comes the most terrifying film ever made. Friday the 13th. And that's all we had. We really didn't know what we were going to make. We just wanted to see if anybody would be interested in buying it.
Cunningham was able to secure financing for Friday the 13th through the same trio of East Coast investors who funded and distributed Last House on the Left. Robert Barsamian, Stephen Manasian, and Philip Scuderi, owners of the Esquire Theaters chain, and who, under their Georgetown Productions banner, were ready to make their mark on motion picture history. But first, they needed one thing: a script.
The longest part of the process of creating the first Friday the 13th was figuring out the venue. So I had to find some territory that was adult-free, more or less.
Camp Crystal Lake has changed.
Oh, terrific.
So came up with summer camp. Sean said, let's go with it, and that was that.
The thing about the story in Friday the 13th is that it's so profoundly simple. I think part of that had to do with the fact that we had very little time to waste on conventional things like character and plot. We had this notion that these kids would be out at a summer camp and would be threatened by some kind of serial killer, and we would then be surprised to discover who the serial killer was at the end.
I thought that basically what I had done was I had taken Mom and Apple Pie and the clean, wonderful, let's have a ball Pepsi generation, these clean-cut kids who are out having fun and unfettered by adult restrictions, and stood it on its head, and I just knocked them off one by one.
By the fall of 1979, with a script in hand and a production budget of approximately $550,000, Cunningham and his protege Steve Miner began searching for the ideal location that would become the cursed hamlet of Crystal Lake.
The film was shot in a small little Boy Scout camp called Camp Novi Bosco. It was off-season, so all the kids had gone home, and we were able to take it over. And so it was a standing, working camp, and it was a whole bunch of log cabins and all that stuff. It was an archery range, it was a lake, it was everything. It was just a little bit colder than it normally would be in the summer.
Like most tales set at summer camp, Friday the 13th begins around a campfire. It's Friday, June 13th, 1958. And lovelorn counselors Claudette and Barry soon find their late-night tryst interrupted by a murderous stranger, making them the first on-screen victims in what would become one of the biggest body counts in film history.
Fans have often asked if we plan to shoot a more gruesome on-screen death for the character Claudette. There are even some photos that show her throat being sliced open by a machete. I think it was Savini, fooling around in the makeup room, because we didn't have time to shoot that kind of a big production.
As I originally laid out the character of the killer and the clues as to who the killer was, in the original scene you saw a missing finger. And so that every time you saw this hand without a finger, that would be your clue that this was the killer. And for time and budgetary constraints, that got dropped out.
As the film shifts to present day, we are introduced to a cast of fresh faces culled from New York's thriving theater scene. And as would become the rule for all future Fridays, the young would-be victims had to be likable, and they had to work cheap.
My partner at the time, Julie Hughes, and I were pretty much the major casting people on Broadway, but we had done a few films. So we looked forward to doing this, particularly with the idea of finding all sorts of new talent for the young kids in the film.
Julie Hughes said, you're not right for this, but they're doing this movie and they need camp counselors and you would be perfect. So then they sent me to meet Sean and audition for Friday the 13th.
Hi, I'm going to Camp Crystal Lake.
You have to figure out as many different ways of making the teenagers dumb without being really stupid.
I think we better stop.
Because the audience has got to be saying, as they sit there as part of this roller coaster ride, don't go in there, girl. Don't go in there. Oh, no.
To play their heroine, The filmmakers required a resourceful and intelligent young actress who could not only fight back against the machete-wielding killer, but could also hold her own against the amorous advances of doomed camp owner Steve Christie.
Do I really look like that?
You did last night.
My backstory to Alice was she was an art student, art major, psychology minor, and she had gotten her job through a friend of a friend who knew Steve Christie.
Give me another chance.
He obviously had the hots for her. Alice was big on space. You know, she needed lots of elbow room. She had to think things out. She was very confused.
I'll give it a week.
And who knows, maybe at the end of the summer something would have happened. But he was going to have to be patient. And he didn't seem like the patient type.
Well, there's no crazy people around here, right?
And the role of resident prankster Ned was Mark Nelson, who had recently starred on Broadway with his Friday the 13th co-star Janine Taylor, whose happy-go-lucky character Marcy was given a fitting posthumous surname.
The character wasn't named Marcy Cunningham. She didn't really have a last name at first, and later on, after we wrapped, Sean Cunningham decided, I guess, to adopt me because I ended up with his last name.
For the role of Bill, the proverbial good guy who proves to be a contender for Alice's affections, as well as a potential suspect, the filmmakers cast the son of one of Hollywood's most beloved legends.
Harry Crosby was the son of the legendary singer Bing Crosby, who was a popular singer in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
He had so many great stories about his dad, who had just passed away, so it was probably kind of emotional for him to share much about his father.
How can you guys eat that stuff? It looks like dead animals.
Playing the nurturing and animal-loving Brenda, who learned just how dangerous and deadly an archery range could be, was the late Laurie Bartram, who sadly lost a long battle with cancer in 2007.
Laurie Bartram, we miss her so dearly. She was truly the heart and soul on that production. I remember her. She was who you saw, you know, worried about everyone.
I was really shocked and upset to hear she died so young. Beautiful person, inside and out.
But the young man whose fame would far surpass 6 Degrees of Friday the 13th was at the time a struggling New York actor whose biggest film role to date had been in the blockbuster 1978 comedy Animal House.
I was surrounded by terrific young talent, and particularly Kevin Bacon. I just thought he was so good and so professional.
I remember when I called his agent to see if he would do Friday the 13th. The agent said, "Well, what does he do in the film?" I said, "Well, mostly he just, makes love to a lot of girls." And the agent said, "Well, Kevin loves to do that."
Footloose was his breakout moment. Of course, he skyrocketed, but it was very obvious to me that he was going to be a star.
One of the most memorable characters in Friday the 13th was Crystal Lake's resident Prophet of Doom, played by veteran actor Walt Gorney, who passed away in 2004.
I know a lot of the fans of Friday the 13th love and admire Crazy Ralph.
It's got a death curse.
And this sounds strange, but it's the truth. I thought that Walt Gorney really was crazy. He kind of frightened me, and I realize now he might have been a little eccentric, but he was just a very, very fine character actor.
It's so sad that he wasn't here to share all this acclaim over Friday the 13th. He would have loved it.
As filming commenced on September 4th, 1979, cast and crew experienced their share of low-budget filmmaking misfortunes, and Cunningham's silent partner, Phil Scuderi, remained dissatisfied with certain elements of Victor Miller's script. Enter Ron Kurz.
I was sent down there to do some rewrites and basically to also see what was going on. I don't want to say I was a spy, but
The only scene I had a problem with was the inclusionary scene of the motorcycle policeman, which really argued against the concept that this was a geography that was kind of off bounds for the police.
I had never been on a motorcycle before, And in fact, I did fall on my ass. The motorcycle fell on me. And of course, Sean and Steve Miner come running to help me. You okay, Ron? They lifted it up and I said, I'm fine.
Although all of the human actors who met their on-screen demise came out of the film unscathed, one on-screen fatality was in fact very real.
I remember all of us playing the scene and the poor snake. It was a real snake and he was chopped into bits. And for that, on behalf of myself and anyone who's ever harmed a snake, I would like to tell all snakes, poisonous or not, I'm sorry.
Wanting to up the ante on Halloween's minimalist shocks, Sean Cunningham needed to find someone who could create the realistic, larger-than-life death sequences called for in the script. In the world of practical special effects, a new dawn was emerging.
When I decided to make Friday the 13th, my job was to try to figure out how to make something scary for very little money and very little production value.
The original Friday the 13th came out after Dawn of the Dead, and Dawn of the Dead was sort of the first film that put gore effects really in the forefront.
Sean had seen Dawn of the Dead, or somebody had seen Dawn of the Dead and said, you're doing Friday the 13th, you got to get this guy. And there were other makeup artists, but my effects had a reputation of being more realistic, and that could be because I was a combat photographer in Vietnam. If the stuff I created didn't give me the same feeling I got when I saw the real stuff, then the fake stuff wasn't good enough, it wasn't real enough. And I think that had a lot to do with the reputation for my effects.
Up comes this guy in a BMW, and it's Tom Savini. He comes in, he's got the script all marked up, and he said, okay, now let's see. We got a hunting arrow up through the chest, that's no problem. I got an axe in the face here on page 40. Do you want a real face and a fake axe, or you want a fake face and a real axe?
It's porno, really, isn't it? So the money shot in these slasher movies is the big kill.
Sean was very insistent that we borrow from Hitchcock that piece of Psycho, which was to surprise the audience within the first 20 minutes with, these people are not screwing around.
People have said to me that my character was sort of like the Janet Leigh in Psycho, because I'm the setup. I'm the setup character to follow.
Excuse me, how far is Camp Crystal Lake from here?
It is a lot of fun being the first person killed in present-day time of Friday the 13th. But I didn't last too long. We did the little stunt jumping out of the Jeep and running through the woods, and that was really great fun.
You see her up against a tree, and the knife comes up and passes through frame, and she's standing there for a second. She puts her hand up, and you're thinking, oh, maybe she's okay, and then the blood pours out.
The piece was very small that was on my neck, so there was already a slit in the piece, and it was covered very well, so the tube just ran down my sleeve, and Tom was right there working the blood, just right off camera. It really did look great.
The beauty of these movies, and kind of the slasher movie genre ultimately is, you can go and just, if you want to go see people get killed in a variety of interesting and compelling ways, you can go and have that. If you want a little bit of nudity, chances are you're going to get that as well. And I know as a young man, that's what I wanted.
I needed the TNA for me, to hell with the audience.
Bikinis and swimming, and it's all just young and hormonal. Everybody wants to have sex with each other.
Oh my God! I actually took my clothes off. Yes, it was for a great reason. I got to have screen sex with Kevin Bacon.
Then when poor Nettie is on top, we don't actually see him killed, but I thought that was so brilliant. With the blood dripping down, it's like, ah!
There you have Kevin Bacon all satiated and smoking dope, and he gets an arrow through his neck.
I thought that was so creative and so brilliant. Probably my favorite.
But I had done George Romero's Martin, and in Martin, a guy had to get a stick in his neck. In Kevin Bacon's case, we put that wife beater on the fake body. He's like on his knees under the bed with his head here, and here's the fake body. Me and my buddy Tasso under there, and I'm pushing the arrow through, and Tasso was pumping the blood. But an accident occurred. The tube separated from Tasso's pump, so he grabbed it and blew in it. And that's what made the blood shoot out, which, gurgle, was a happy accident. It made the effect, bloodier and grislier.
She screams and the axe comes up and you see the axe make contact with the light. That was completely Tom's idea, as to make the audience realize that this axe is a real axe that has substance to it and it's heavy.
I don't remember precisely what showed up on film, but I do know that the scene was a lot longer than what ended up in the final cut. No pun intended.
Sex is part of the driving thing. There is this war between sex and violence that goes on.
Sex, die. Have sex, die. That's the premise. That's the underlying theme, going through the Friday the 13th movies. Is Sean Cunningham like a devout, born-again Christian or something?
I don't believe Friday the 13th was a morality play. Alice had sensibilities, and she was not part of what I'd call the clique or the in-group or whatever.
The reason the girl who didn't make love survived was that she was not distracted. It's not that she was more moral than the others. She just had nobody to make it with, so she was not busy.
I remember one particular one where Adrienne is in the kitchen and she thinks she's safe, and there's a place where she just goes, and just as that happens, wham, somebody comes flying through the window.
You didn't see Laurie Bartram die, the girl in the archery range. She was just thrown through the window. It was actually me in her nightgown and wig going through the window.
But Cunningham's insistence that he would not give the audience any clues that would hint at the killer's real identity resulted in Friday the 13th's penultimate surprise.
Where is the killer? Who is the killer? And we bring in Betsy Palmer.
We cast Betsy Palmer. This was really my strong feeling for Mrs. Voorhees, that she should be somebody warm and comforting. So when that door opens and the audience sees it's this nice mother type.
I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
And you would think of her and be predisposed to think of her as a nice person, who then we find out is crazy.
I had heard, I think probably from Sean, that Estelle Parsons had been offered the role first. And because Estelle and I are actresses of the same age and all.
Because Friday the 13th production schedule got moved back, she could no longer do it. So it was strictly a time thing. It wasn't that she didn't like it or they didn't like her.
By the way, when I read this script, I said, what a piece of junk. I thought, this will come, it will go, nobody will ever know or ever see it.
So I run into Mrs. Voorhees, thinking she's the one who's going to save me.
I felt, oh, this poor thing, and she's telling me about all this disastrous stuff that was going on.
They're all dead. They're all dead.
And then we find out that she had this kid.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those two others were killed?
Poor woman, she lost her son, Jason, while the camp counselors were fooling around.
Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
And it becomes, oh boy, look out now. Now I get it.
You let him drown. You never paid any attention.
In retrospect, I think Psycho got in a way that I was not conscious of at all.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
I basically reversed Tony Perkins and his mother. And I had the mother alive and the kid dead.
She's revenging poor Jason's death. And she believes that it's our fault.
All of a sudden, I hear the voice in my head saying,
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
There's another place where Betsy, who's really an incredible actress, she did a thing, and I even pointed it out to her one day, and when you say the line...
He wasn't a very good swimmer.
And you smiled. You're crazy, you know it, and you don't care. And that's really scary.
I won't, Jason. I won't.
I came up with the idea for Jason's name because originally I had called him, it was going to be Josh. But the more I worked on the film and the creepier the whole subject of that got, I stuck with the J and went to Jason. And I knew a kid named Jason when I was, about 8, 9, or 10 years old. And he was one of them sneaky little bastards who was always telling on people, and he was a mean little guy. And so I never really liked his name.
Despite having played arguably one of the most demented villainesses ever to appear on screen, Betsy Palmer has amassed a large and largely sympathetic cult following.
When I'm doing the autograph signing conventions, they put their babies in my arms, and this killer lady holds a little child, or the little children come up and all. I've said to people, I said, why? Why do you love her as much as you do when she's supposed to be this dreadful human being? And they say, because we understand why you did it.
Mrs. Voorhees, to my thinking, had every reason to keep a camp closed because otherwise somebody else's son would drown, just like her little Jason. And that's all she was doing, was making sure that that never happened to another mother ever again.
I've never felt that she was anything but a mother who was trying to care for a poor wounded cub.
I mean, I couldn't imagine. I'd just go crazy myself if my grandson, who I'm raising as my son, if something happened to him. So I can clearly identify with Betsy Palmer's character.
Here's a child who's been ignored, neglected. I honestly felt like, hey, here's one for all those kids who have been set to the side because they were different.
Many years ago, with the help of a very fine psychologist, I saw that Mrs. Voorhees is the mother I never had. She is the mother who will kill people to avenge her son's death.
Undeniably, one of the film's most memorable characters is its iconic musical score, and the now infamous sound effect created by composer Harry Manfredini.
So much of the delight of Friday the 13th and the experience of it came from the sound effects and the music.
Somehow or other, the music had to evoke and point out the fact that the killer was there. It wasn't just the camera shooting, it was the POV of the killer.
Harry's delightful signature piece, the...
If you go to the end of the film, you'll see a very close-up of Betsy Palmer's, Mrs. Voorhees' mouth, where she's saying to herself, "Kill her, Mommy.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her."
I just went and I took the consonant sound of the K, K-I from killer, and M-A from mommy. I went up to a microphone and just went, and we ran it through something called an Echoplex, which was a gizmo back in the late 70s, early 80s, and it ended up coming, and that, of course, became the instant sound that I needed to bring the killer into the first reel and throughout the picture.
And I'm sure that without Harry's music and without the sound effects, we never would have had the success that finally happened.
I think the women were stronger in this film than the guys were. You know, look who it came down to. The battle was between Mrs. Voorhees and Alice.
There was a sequence that I was to, I'd begun to really lose it. Smack her, give her a hit alongside of her. Oh, when we hit somebody on stage, we hit somebody. So I hauled off and I gave her a smack. She fell to the ground, crying, "Sean, Sean, she hit me. And he came over, he said, no, Betsy, we don't do that in movies. I said, well, what are we supposed to do? He said, you'll miss her. And he said, we'll just bring in the sound afterwards.
Alice doesn't want to die, and she fights back. And then they go through this incredible beach ballet.
We're, of course, pounding away at one another, and I have her hair, and then she goes at me with some sort of a boat oar.
My favorite kill of all, Mrs. Voorhees, slow-mo. Doesn't get better than that. The ultimate kill by Alice.
The assistant director came up and said, hey, we're going to cut your head off. He said, don't you want to see how we're going to do it? I said, you've got to be kidding. I could care less how you're going to chop my head off.
Tasso Stavrakis was my assistant on that movie. We actually made a cast of Betsy Palmer's head, made a rubber dummy of it, and we decorated the inside so when it severed, you would see anatomically correct gore in there.
It was Tommy Savini's assistant. It was attached to him in some way. And Tommy Savini is the one that cut it off.
What I did was I attached it with toothpicks. So the toothpicks were just kind of holding it in place, knowing that when I whacked it with that machete, it would go through the toothpicks. And I wanted to whack it so the head would spin, which luckily it did on the first take.
Well, I mean, I don't have hair on the back of my hands, like he did. I thought that was a little weird in one shot.
If you watch the movie, when Betsy Palmer is decapitated, her hands come up into frame and kind of like a grabbing air. They're Tasso's hands with hairy knuckles. It's not Betsy Palmer, it's these big meat puffs that he's got as hands.
Even after the dramatic death of Mrs. Voorhees, a final crucial scene remained. One that would prove to be Cunningham's master stroke, and a defining moment that would, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, spawn a franchise.
In talking to Sean about the ending, they really didn't have an ending, and I had just seen Carrie. In Carrie, beautiful job, Brian De Palma convinced you the movie is over.
She's walking around in the graveyard, the hand comes up and grabs her. Scared the bejesus out of me, and I'm sure anyone else who ever saw it.
So I said to Sean, why don't we have Jason jump out of the lake, and attack her? But Jason's dead, he said, and I clearly remember that, if it's a dream, you can get away with anything.
You can call it an homage, I call it a theft. Grand theft cinema.
I mean, everybody, including the special effects man, to the girl who typed up the memos, to the girl who went out for lunch, claimed to have written this scene. But I wrote it.
At first, they were thinking of having Noel Cunningham, Sean's son, do it. But his wife would have none of that.
My mother said, "You're out of your mind if I'm going to let my kid spend 4 hours in a lake in the middle of fall in New Jersey to be in your stupid movie." Were it not for her, I would have been Jason. I would have been the first Jason, and I'm not bitter.
Prior to that, I had been in Manny's Orphans, and I played this kid, Roger, who was like a slightly sex-obsessed little kid. So Steve Miner just kind of said, hey, let's get Ari to do it.
My investors in Boston wanted to have it more extreme in seaweed, and maybe he could be deformed a little bit. And Tom Savini said, I've got a great idea, and he started to make his head lopsided and put a weird eye on him, and it just became more and more extreme.
We dredged up part of the pond, and Tom Savini used real swamp muck for that.
I came upon a picture in this group of Polaroids, and I said, and who's this? And he said, oh, that's your son. I said, well, why does he look so strange? And he said, he's a mongoloid. I said, he's what? I said, that wasn't in the script.
That's a nightmare Jason that comes out of the water. The real Jason was probably just an almost ordinary child. And so that part is a total dream, or it was in my mind.
We wind up having this gorgeous, idyllic setting, on the lake, in the canoe. I did everything I could to tell the audience that it's okay now, you can relax, it's over.
But the strongest aspect is Harry Manfredini's soundtrack.
That was really the first time in the film where the music stopped being the music for the killer and started to really manipulate you.
It's over. The police have come. The cavalry's here.
It went on so long that even the people who were positive something was going to happen pretty much gave up that something was going to happen.
Alice has this look of hope, and she's just trailing her fingers in the water, and bam!
And it was a wonderful addition. I mean, I think that Sean's idea is right, that it really wasn't finished until that.
One of the really delightful things that we could do is go to a screening and watch the people jump at the end, because for whatever reasons, this ending got them.
I'm telling you, people just flew out of the seats and ran out of the theater, and Sean was just like a little kid going, I got them all.
I think without that single moment, I don't think Friday would have been half as successful as it was, because the people got to leave, strangely enough, with a smile on their face. They got tricked, and they loved it.
In the next scene, Alice wakes up, and they tell her no one else was found. It was only her, everyone else is dead.
I remember the scene in the hospital vividly, because when she asked me about the boy, and I go,
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
And she says,
Then he's still there.
and he certainly was.
I knew that we're looking at a part 2 here.
Those little drops at the end, those little ripples in the water at the end. It's like, well, was it a dream? Was it a dream? Are those raindrops or those air bubbles? And I think now we know the answer.
In early 1980, the film was picked up for domestic distribution by Frank Mancuso Sr., VP of Paramount Pictures, who planned a national release and a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign. The risk paid off. And for Paramount, Sean Cunningham, and Georgetown Productions, Friday the 13th was about to become their lucky day.
Frank Mancuso was head of distribution at Paramount, and he had the idea of treating this little movie as if it were a real movie. And it had no stars and nothing recognizable except this sort of strange, superstitious title, and went out and sold it like crazy.
1, 2, 3, Friday the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough.
Friday the 13th opened on May 9th, 1980, eventually taking in $39.7 million at the U.S. box office. If the reason behind the film's immense popularity was lost on mainstream critics, who not only hated the film but eviscerated it, no one was more stunned by its success than its creators. For better or worse, Friday the 13th would change their lives, and the horror genre, forever.
When it first started, it was repeat business that made it successful. It was teenage girls going to see and then bringing their girlfriends and then dragging their boyfriend to see it. It was all this repeat business.
Before Friday the 13th, maybe the most successful quote-unquote horror movies were handled on a very limited basis, like Halloween or even Carrie. They weren't treated as major motion pictures.
The fact that that one became so wildly successful, and producers jumped on it as this is an opportunity for us to sell this off and make more and more films.
You also have to remember, this was back in 1980. This was before cable TV, before the internet, before VHS, really, before DVD. So if you wanted to get anything that was really titillating, horror was the only place you could go. There was something exciting about it because it was breaking new grounds. And of course, your parents didn't want you to see it, which only made you want to see it that much more and made it that much better when you did see it.
The modern horror movie was kind of born because it now became a possible player in the mainstream distribution of movies.
It's like Night of the Living Dead with Romero. Those guys involved in that all had careers after that.
I thought it was a piece of crap, and I truthfully didn't care if my name got on it or not at that time. And then when it opened, my God.
The critical reaction to Friday the 13th was so abysmal that I knew we were going to be a success. I mean, there was one critic who wanted us all arrested and tried for horrible crimes against humanity.
I'm convinced it has something to do with the growth of the women's movement in America in the last decade. I think that these films are some sort of primordial response by some very sick people of men saying, get back in your place, women.
And I was upset by all of the terrible publicity and the scorn and the ridicule.
Gene Siskel gave us the scathing review. I think he even may have published Betsy Palmer's address saying, write to her nasty things because she's a terrible person.
How dare Betsy Palmer play a role like this in Friday the 13th when she has made herself so lovable, and I've Got a Secret all these years and all the television shows she's done. How dare she play a role like that and insult her viewing audience? And I thought, well, those who can do and those who can't criticize.
The first of the slashers were to reflect the changing attitudes and ideas about women and what they could do. I think we go back to Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, Sissy Spacek in Carrie, Sigourney Weaver. Alice, all of a sudden, is the sole survivor. And I believe it was a direct reflection of what was going on in the world. And I think Friday the 13th really empowered women.
So after Friday the 13th was released, there spawned a whole new industry of teenage horror films based on holidays or based on a serial killer, based on very low budgets and low writing. Strangely enough, I think that people often sort of imitated my mistakes rather than the stuff that I got right.
Well, Friday the 13th was the greatest experience for me up until the point of after it opening. It was huge. It was fabulous. It was an actor's dream come true. It certainly was for me. And then slowly I realized I had a stalker. The stalking was not taken seriously back in 1980. And it wasn't something that everyone was aware of. I was starting to get phone calls back then. It was so easy to get phone numbers. He got into my apartment. For over a year, I didn't know who my stalker was. And what happened was he befriended me. He actually worked his way into my life, so I was actually giving him information about my stalker. I had an ordeal with him up close at one point, which in itself is a horror movie. Eventually, I had a gun to my head, and I was able to talk the fan down. It really took its toll for a while, but it's all okay now. It's all good now. And having 3 generations of fans from around the world that fly in to wherever I am at a city or a convention that really talk to me and care and tell me how much it affected them when they found out, it's just a gift. It's a beautiful thing, and I thank them.
I've turned around my thinking about it. I think it worked out just the way it was supposed to. And I have never felt that I damaged my career. If anything, there are people that would never know I existed.
We had this tiny little movie that cost $500,000, made in a Boy Scout camp in New Jersey. I just cannot imagine how we got here from there.
It kind of launched the whole mythology. And it wasn't by accident, but it was kind of good fortune.